CNN's reporting new intelligence suggests Israel is preparing possible strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, U.S. officials say. The U.S. has obtained new intelligence suggesting that Israel is making preparations to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, even as the Trump administration has been pursuing a diplomatic deal with Tehran. Multiple U.S. officials familiar with the latest intelligence told CNN. Such a strike would be a brazen break with President Donald Trump, U.S. officials said. It could also risk tipping off a broader regional conflict in the Middle East, something the U.S. has sought to avoid since the war in Gaza inflamed tensions beginning in 2023. Officials caution it is not clear that Israeli leaders have made a final decision, and that, in fact, there is deep disagreement within the U.S. government about the likelihood that Israel will ultimately act. Whether and how Israel strikes will likely depend on what it thinks of the U.S. negotiations with Tehran over its nuclear program. Now, I've heard information that Tehran is basically saying they don't expect the talks to be fruitful. Personally, I don't expect the talks to be fruitful. I know Donald Trump is adamant about being, peace through strength, but he doesn't want a war. He doesn't want to see a bunch of people dying. But I just feel like the goal for Tehran is to get a nuclear weapon, and I don't think that they're going to be dissuaded by talks. What do you guys think?
So I guess as the resident Jew, I think the take here really is that there are some so-called isolationist types, I guess, working in the administration, and they are leaking classified information from us spying on Israel. Israel spies on us as well, so let's not get too upset about that. But they're trying to undermine...
Everybody spies on everybody.
Everybody spies on everybody, but I guess the position of these U.S. officials is trying to leak to who? To CNN, to try to undermine Israel trying to prepare themselves to strike Iran. Look, Israel preparing to strike Iran is nothing new. I just think it's kind of rich that there's some in the administration trying to do this now, given how a week or so or two, Trump was saying that he wanted to strike them himself. So we'll see how the rest of these Iran nuclear deals kind of plays out and the negotiations play out. I don't think Iran wants to go to complete denuclearization, which has been the standard. I don't think Trump wants to get himself into another so-called JCPOA because he ran so harshly against that. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon...
What's the JCPOA for the viewers?
The JCPOA was the first Iran nuclear deal that Obama struck with the Ayatollah, and the idea here was that they were able to enrich uranium up to a certain percent, and then there was a sunset clause which allowed them to enrich even further. It also allowed their economy not to have our different sanctions on them, and then they were able to use this capital for whatever they wanted. In many cases, it went to fund their anti-American and anti-Israel proxies in the region, including Hezbollah that Israel had to deal with, or the Houthis now that the entire world has to deal with. But if Iran was able to acquire a nuclear weapon, it would change the entire landscape of the Middle East, and it's been U.S. policy to not allow them to do that, and I think that's a good thing. Tate, how was my spin there?
It's pretty good. I mean, for me, it looks like Iran and Israel, they engage in this happens all the time, where the U.S., when we were negotiating the Abraham Accords, Iran, Hamas, or Hezbollah, being an Iranian proxy, launches an attack to blow up the Abraham Accords. And likewise, this does to me seem like it could be a situation where Israel knows that there's a nuclear deal potentially getting closer to being signed, and they're trying to posture with Iran, maybe inflame that again to see if Iran will walk away from the negotiating table.
I do think Trump is liable to sign a relatively bad deal and spin it as a good deal because he wants to stack up accomplishments. Things are going very sluggishly in the Ukraine-Russia war that he promised to end as soon as he came into office, but wasn't able to. He promised on ending the war in Israel and Gaza that's actually just flamed up even more recently with their new Israel's new offensive into Gaza, the so-called Gideon's chariots that they're doing. So I think Trump's trying to rack up some wins, and I think he's willing to go a little bit beyond the pale, but I hope we don't get something like a JCPOA Part 2. Aiden, what do you think?
I mean, the State Department has been kind of challenging Israel publicly on the war in Gaza right now. So I think there 100% is a dynamic in the Trump administration where there are more isolationist types that want to make sure that nothing blows up, and they actually be concerned that Israel is going to do something, and I do think that is plausible that Israel may try to goad Iran into walking away from the deal so they can try and coerce the U.S. to continue supporting what they're doing in Gaza, even though Rubio and Trump have kind of been calling for that to die down a little bit. I ultimately think that with Israel and Iran and Trump, I mean, even the previous relationship with Iran under the Trump first term, and even with Biden, Iran will always go and say something super inflammatory. So will Israel, and at the end of the day, nobody actually wants a war there, because I think we all recognize that it would be complete hell.
Well, I mean, a broad war, I think you're right. And it's this may seem a little counterintuitive, but I think that if Israel were to strike Iran on its own without the U.S., right, especially if the U.S. is, looking to broker a deal or is looking to talk, regardless of the likelihood of that deal actually bearing fruit or Iran sticking to the deal, if Israel strikes Iran without the U.S. blessing, I think that that's more likely to inflame the Middle East, because the U.S., overwhelming military power, if the U.S. strikes, or if the U.S. is backing an Israeli strike, then the rest of the region is like, well, the U.S. is kind of standing there saying, don't do anything back. But if the U.S. is at odds with Israel and Israel strikes, then the rest of the region might be like, well, there's some daylight between the two. So I feel like Israel's really making a significantly worse decision to go it on their own, and it's far more volatile for the rest of the Middle East.
I think Israel says they'd go at it on their own, but I don't think they'd actually have the capability to. And if they did ever want to have a successful attack on Iran's nuclear sites, I think they'd have to have the blessing and support from the United States. I don't think they just have enough armament to do it, and they can't get on the bad side of the United States. I love how the United States, they have their plausible deniability with it. It's like, oh no, we had no, it was just the Israelis. Not like we armed them to the teeth and literally are spying on them and have all the information about what they're planning anyway. So I just don't see this happening without the Trump administration's blessing. I could have seen this as like some isolationists in the administration trying to get ahead of this.
When you say isolationists, are you talking about people like J.D. Vance? Are you talking about America First people? Or are you talking about people that actually are actual isolationists?
I guess it's on a spectrum.
It's not my sense that there's a lot of people in the administration that are actually isolationists.
So it's a spectrum. I want to say J.D. Vance is more on the isolationist side as compared to Marco Rubio, who would be on the flip side, and maybe Pete Hegseth is in the middle. Mike Waltz was probably on the most hawkish side of that, and he got cut out of the picture. So that's how I think this is coming from a camp of people who don't want United States involved in the Middle East one way or another, in striking Iran or supporting countries financially.
The reason I ask is because I disagree with the idea of people like J.D. Vance being an isolationist. I think that he is the quintessential America First guy. And I mean, if you're an America First person, and I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Aiden. If you're an America First person, that doesn't mean you want to, or at least my understanding when you hear these people talk about it, it's not that they're talking about the U.S. withdrawing from the rest of the world. It's just the U.S. doesn't need to be active in every military action in a place that the U.S. has an interest.
I think a couple things can be true. One, Israel is its own nation. It is its own country. It can make the decisions that it wants. However, again, the United States does provide significant support to Israel before the military and other programs, so that might make them more resistant to actually going at it alone. As far as the component in D.C., I think there is a growing group of people in D.C. that I wouldn't call them isolationists. I would call them foreign policy realists. The idea that we should not get involved in every single conflict in the world. We shouldn't commit all of our resources everywhere in the world whenever an ally of ours has some kind of problem. Now, again, the situation in Israel is very complex, but even, and I know we'll get to this in a little bit, but even when J.D. Vance started being very vocally critical of the war in Ukraine, he was saying, why are we sending all of our armament to Ukraine and we're not going to be able, we don't have enough munitions to actively counter China if, for whatever reason, we end up starting a hot war with China. So I think that there are people that they want the U.S. to be strong. We want to be secure. We do want to be able to defend our interests across the country or across the world, but ultimately, it's what is the priority? Well, what are the order of priorities? And Elbridge Colby, who's at DOD, he's always been arguing that Taiwan and the South China Sea, that is the number one priority. And everything else takes a backseat.
I love it when people who I interpret to be isolationists are actually hawkish, but just hawkish in a little bit of a different degree, instead of on the Eastern Front, on the way far Eastern
Well, I mean,
Front.
look, it's a strong argument that the most important, strategic location for the U.S. that's not in the U.S. is Taiwan, because the entire modern world runs on the chips that Taiwan.
I guess I feel like this is all very connected, though, and that's why if you're concerned about addressing China, it's worth addressing Russia as well, because China, I think it was
we
last
haven't
year
even
or
got
so,
to Russia yet, though.
they had they said they had an endless relationship between the Chinese and the Russians, and Russians are getting cheap oil right now, or the Chinese are getting cheap oil from the Russians right now. Iran is sending the drones that they have to use in Russia. North Koreans are fighting against Ukrainians in Ukraine right now. So I think all of this stuff is connected, and there's a united front that's against U.S. hegemony, and I think it's worth not just focusing on one part, although I'm extremely hawkish on when it comes to China as well.
You could just stop it. Extremely hawkish.
Yeah. So, well, I believe in peace through strength, and I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to protect, because I think once we pull out, the less involved the United States is in geopolitical affairs, unfortunately, the more stuff breaks down. If the United States stop being interested in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, more conflict would break out in all of these regions, because I think the United States acts as a stabilizing force through the strength in our military power.
I think I would disagree with that. And it is actually it's kind of funny. What you were saying, I think, is most likely true, but it sounds really similar to the whole axis of evil speech from post 9/11, which got us into a lot of problems. And I ultimately think I agree with your broader point, but I will say I don't think the U.S. has been a stabilizing force, especially in Africa. I mean, everything with the Wagner Group. I mean, Russia has been running wild in Africa, and part of the French. It was the French African countries. They screwed everything up in Africa. And then the U.S. had to step in, but the U.S. wasn't prepared to do that, and so the Russians went wild. And ultimately, that is the fault of the French. And I think it goes back to, the U.S. has a lot of different security priorities. We need to make sure those are accomplished. We need to be able to make sure we have the munitions and the agreements to maintain that. But we're always going to fail at it if our allies don't step up to the plate. And I think in the context of Israel, now who knows what the actual situation behind this article is, but the U.S.-Israel relationship, although very strong, is very much push and pull right now. And it's totally within Israel's prerogative to do so, because, again, they have their own strategic interests. But if Iran and Trump are actually serious about a deal, and there is one that's going to come through, it is not in Israel's interest for that to happen. But again, I don't think that they would ultimately make that decision, for the same reason that Trump and Vance go to Europe and they criticize the European Union, and what can they actually do? Nothing, really, because they're not strong. They still rely on U.S. security guarantees, and its function is a drain on us. And I think that part of the work of Trump and JD and Rubio in particular as Secretary of State has been to pull back our commitments in areas where it really doesn't matter. I don't think that our efforts in Africa have been very fruitful. There's a good argument for some of the humanitarian programs, I think, but ultimately we have never had a good relationship with African countries, especially now not with South Africa, and the Chinese and the Russians have been running wild.
Well, let me just say,
Good.
I'll just say too, like last year I backpacked Africa. Wagner is everywhere. And I was backing through Eastern Africa, which is a region that's not on the table, geopolitically speaking. Everywhere, Chinese, everywhere.
Does anyone have a sense of what Russia's goals are, having military, PMCs over there in these areas? Because it's my sense that there's a lot of Islamic terrorism that spawns from that area, and keeping that kind of busy so that way it doesn't reach out into Russia or the U.S. The U.S.'s involvement was to prevent it from reaching out into the U.S. That was a large argument for it. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with it or whatever, but if there's if there's another argument. Well, yeah, I mean, I understand the minerals and stuff, but that's economic stuff. That doesn't.
There's a vacuum there in
Okay.
Eastern Africa.
Okay.
Since the British left, it's just been chaos. the Tanzanians and the Kenyans are massive exporters of oil, specifically and rare earth minerals. Kenya is American aligned, broadly speaking. Tanzania, not so much. And everywhere you go, you're going to see Mandarin. The Chinese are heavily involved in Tanzania. They're setting up massive mines, setting up massive oil rigs. So there's a huge geopolitical advantage there, but it's more of a long-term play. And that's sort of been the problem with the United States is we're not thinking long-term. We're thinking election to election versus the Chinese and the Russians. They can think in terms of generations.
Thanks for checking out this clip from Timcast IRL. Make sure to watch the show live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. Subscribe to this channel, and we will see you all there.